So welcome everybody. We are so excited to have you in class today. My name is Curry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And this is our Friday Fun Day session. So in the next half hour, we're going to dive deep into women's rights in America and looking through the lens of the 19th Amendment. As we have class today, we will be recording it and we will be asking you all for your questions. So feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function. Ask your questions as you go through there, and we'll make sure that our speaker today gets those, and we will ask her those questions and keep going. So a little bit about today's conversation. And first, Professor Jones, thank you so much for being here. So exciting. A little bit about who Professor Jones is and your background, which I actually have to be honest that I learned a few things today as well. So let me give you the kind of the rundown. So Professor Martha Jones is the Society of Black Alumni President a professor of history and a professor of the SNF and Gore Institute at Johns Hopkins University. She's a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Two great books, but there's a lot of amazing writing by Professor Jones. I absolutely loved Vanguard, how Black women broke barriers, won the vote, and insisted on equality for all. Get it, read it. I'll send out the link to you after this. And then another fantastic book that I recommend is Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in the Antebellum America. Think of Professor Jones as a public historian who is really engaging with a wider and broader audience. And that's what makes her perfect for being at our class today. Professor Jones holds a PhD in history from Columbia University, a JD from CUNY School of Law, and this is the part that I learned today. I had no idea that you were a public interest litigator in New York City as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, welcome. Thank you so much. And I see that this was perfect timing because Jeffrey Rosen, the CEO of the National Constitution Center, has joined us as well. So let me make sure that we can hear Jeff, and I will turn it over to Jeff Rosen. You're muted, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Curry, and welcome, Professor Jones. It is so great to have you, and it's such an honor to share your wisdom and light with all of our wonderful students. So welcome to the class.
Thank you.
You've been such a remarkable friend to the National Constitution Center in helping advise us both about the 19th Amendment exhibit, which Curry has behind her, and about our Civil War and Reconstruction exhibit. And I'd love to use our time with you to really teach our friends about the core evolution of the rights of women, including African-American women, from the time of the founding through the civil rights movement. So let's just start at the beginning, and I'll just ask you, because it's such an unfamiliar period, and it's so jarring to realize how different things were. What were the rights of a free white woman at the time of the founding? What rights did she have, and what rights did she not have?
There's, of course, more than one way to answer that question. At the founding, American law incorporates a great deal of English law, the precepts of the colonial era that, in a sense, reduce American women at the founding to something like appendages of their husbands, legally speaking, which is to say, women rarely own their own property. They don't control their own wages. They don't have the capacity to contract. Coverture is the broad sort of principle that we use to characterize where women stand before the law. But there's another answer, isn't there, which is that the ideals of the revolution are not lost on American women, early American women. That is to say, the universal ideals of the founding, those ideals that are articulated most vividly in the Declaration, are ideals that resonate with American women. So I think we could say that from the outset, there is a debate, there is a contest, there is a question, right? Who will American women be? Who should they be? Who can they be before the law? Can they be part of the body politic? And that is a question, we might say, is still one we ask even today.
What a wonderful answer. You so concisely and powerfully sum up both this less than fully equal status of women, embodied in this word coverture, which you used, and Curry in the chat defined coverture as the idea that men will cover their wives and speak and control all of their needs. And you said that limited free women's right to own their own property and to make contracts, among other things. But at the same time, you said there's this ideal of universal equality expressed in the Declaration that women and men invoked to argue for the expansion of women's rights over time. Wonderful. Well, sort of take us up. Now let's move to the antebellum period, the period before the Civil War. Who were some of the important women voices who were arguing, invoking the Declaration to argue for the end to these disabilities like coverture? And how did they express their views?
So again, how we answer that question depends upon which women, right? That American women, even as early as the antebellum period, are hardly a monolith in the United States. And there are fractures among and between women, enslaved women and free women, Black women and white women, immigrant women and Native women. And so here, it's not an easy question to answer, but it's to say that by the time we get to the 1830s, certainly in many corners, in many quarters, American women are beginning to ask questions about who they are before the Constitution, who they are before the law, who they are in relationship to politics, who they are in relationship to power. For the African-American women about whom I write, those conversations, those debates, those questions emerge interestingly first in church communities, where African-American women are, if you will, the foot soldiers, right, of institutions. They fill the pews, they raise the money, they support the minister. And by the 1830s, these are women who are also beginning to wonder if their talents, their capacities aren't being not only overlooked, but perhaps squandered, right, in a community that could indeed benefit from their whole participation. So that's an example. We have examples of meetings among white American women, like that in 1848 of Seneca Falls, New York, where women ask a whole set of questions, including those that Black women have been asking in church about women's authority in the pulpit, but also about women's authority when it comes to political rights. There is not one conversation, there's not one debate, there's not quite one movement, but across many parts of the nation, American women are at work beginning to ask those kinds of questions and beginning to leverage, in many instances, the kind of contributions that they already do make to at least getting them a moment at the table, if not a chair.
What a remarkable contribution you made in discovering these African-American women asserting their rights in church. And it's so important, as you say, to contrast that with those of other women voices, including those at Seneca Falls, who were embracing some of the same messages. Are there particular women and particular texts you'd like to call our attention to inspire our friends? We talked about Elizabeth Cady Stanton's address on women's rights after Seneca Falls, which is surprising to a modern ear, although it invokes the Declaration of Independence on behalf of the rights of that all men and women are created equal. We certainly wouldn't call it a call for racial equality in the way that we understand it now. Tell us about that speech and any other particular women of this era you'd like to focus on.
Sure. Let me introduce Mariah Stewart. Stewart is born in Connecticut, was a bound servant as a young woman or girl, really. She migrates to Boston, becomes an educator, a part of the Baptist community there. She's widowed and confronts a new phase in her life by the 1830s. And she's very inspired by the kinds of civil rights politics that are really taking hold in a city like Boston, where slavery has disappeared by and large, and now Black Americans are struggling with the questions that today we would refer to as civil rights questions. Mariah Stewart strikes up a friendship with William Lloyd Garrison, the publisher of the great anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. And Garrison begins to publish her thoughts, and this wins her a stint at the podium. And she becomes the very first American woman of any color to speak about politics before a so-called mixed audience, as we would have thought about it in the 19th century, an audience of men and women. What does she have to say? She says, I think you are squandering our talents. When you imagine that all women can do is fathom the kettle, right? Think about the kitchen. We as a community are missing the opportunity to draw upon women's talents, women's capacities, women's ideas, and more. And Stewart is drawing in part on principles from the Declaration. She is a close reader of the Bible and finds in the Bible women who were leaders. And she weaves together an argument that in the end is so ahead of its time that her career at the podium is cut short, that really Bostonians are not prepared to be confronted yet by a woman who so forthrightly suggests, not just suggests, says, maybe men aren't getting all the work done that we need done, and maybe we need women too. Stewart will become an educator. She is an educator, and she will continue a long life as an educator. And this is part of the story, I think, of women's rights and women's suffrage in the US, which is to say, she herself retires from the podium, but she trains next generations, right, of young women in the art of elocution, right, in public speaking, in how to read critically and how to craft their own ideas. And so she has a tremendous legacy because not only does she have this short stint at the podium, but then she goes on to teach many generations.
That is so exciting that you shared with us Mariah Stewart's story. Is there a quick search suggests that her lecture, Why Sit Ye Here and Die, at Franklin Hall in Boston, are there particular speeches that we can put in the chat box that our friends can read?
Absolutely. And fortunately, historian Marilyn Richardson put together a short volume of Mariah Stewart's speeches, and I recommend them because I think, in a way you alluded to earlier, they sound, while the parlance is very 19th century, the ideas feel very 21st century, right? That to recognize that American women 200 years ago are already leveling the critique that we sometimes call intersectionality, right? That this notion that we have to think about politics as they work through the problem of racism and sexism simultaneously. Mariah Stewart knows that 200 years ago. And so she's absolutely worth going back to see how she expresses those ideas.
So important. One of our friends in the question box, as a college professor, once stated that African-American men were aligned with women, but to secure their vote, dropped the Black men. Is this true? And can you add to that? That story of the fissure between white women and African-American men and women is so important. And maybe you could also point to particular figures that we can read and learn from.
So let me introduce one of my favorite figures from the 19th century, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Frances Harper was born in Baltimore in the 1820s. She was an educator turned poet, turned anti-slavery lecturer. all by the time she was 30 years old. By the 1860s, this critical moment for an old community of women's rights and anti-slavery activists, Frances Harper is there with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, with Frederick Douglass, Susan Anthony, Wendell Phillips, in the meetings of the American Equal Rights Association, where now this community, this radical community, is trying to ferret out its relationship to the 14th and the 15th Amendments. And in particular, they are preoccupied with the question of how voting rights might be transformed in the wake of the Civil War and through Reconstruction. Now, oftentimes we tell that story, I think, somewhat as a parody, because we imagine that what it was a contest between Elizabeth Stanton on the one hand, who is an advocate of educated suffrage, which is a code for saying she thinks white women, middle-class women in particular, should have the vote first before others should get the vote. And on the other hand, Douglass, who says, you know, for Black women, voting rights is a matter of life and death. Now, you only can imagine that they were the only two there if you don't read the minutes. And so that's part of my job, is to go back to the minutes, because there's Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who has also come to these meetings. And she has yet another view. And because she's a poet, everything she says is as eloquent as it can be. But her intervention is to say to this community, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And this is a vision that Black women bring to politics, not of the fractures of race or gender, which they cannot navigate because they are both Black and women. And they begin to speak about a political vision, a view, a set of ideals that are responsive to all of humanity. Watkins Harper does not idealize women's rights. She says, you know, women are not dewdrops, you know, exhaled from the skies. They are good, bad, and indifferent. And the vote is not a panacea, because what Harper wants, and I'll just introduce one more term, what Harper's interested in and what she puts on the table and other Black women will pick up and carry is the notion that Black women are also looking for dignity. Yes, equality, but also dignity. And what does she mean by that? She means that Black women like her, particularly activists who travel as a part of their vocation, know that where the rubber hits the road for them are on those streetcars, on those railroads, on those steamers, where they are not permitted to sit in a ladies' car, where they are ejected from first-class seats despite having bought the ticket. That when Black women come and they talk about dignity, they are, Watkins Harper is attempting to offer a corrective to Douglass, offer a corrective to Stanton, to say you're missing, right, where it is that for Black women, the questions of rights is really being lived. And it is in these terribly denigrating and sometimes violent confrontations that they are uniquely subject to in ordinary public life.
That is remarkable, because you're teaching us that, of course, this is taking place against a backdrop where after the Civil War, African-American men are formally granted the vote in the 15th Amendment, and all persons are formally granted equal protection of the law. But of course, the Supreme Court eviscerates the promise of those amendments, both by allowing the disenfranchisement of African-American men, as well as upholding separate but equal railway cars and theaters, and the Southern redemption that eviscerates the promise of those amendments. So it's so important to learn that people like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper are recognizing the importance of dignity against that backdrop. Okay, take us up now about some representative figures in that period of redemption in the years leading up to the 19th Amendment, who are arguing for women's suffrage as the beginning of a fulfillment of the promise of the Declaration of Independence.
So let's move ahead to the 1890s, a period that we oftentimes associate with the founding of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and a new life of the women's suffrage movement. That is not an organization that by and large African American women join, ever. And instead, in 1896, African American women will found the National Association of Colored Women. Mary Church Terrell will be the first president. Terrell is from Memphis, Tennessee, educated at Oberlin in Ohio, has settled in Washington, where she is an educator at the M Street High School, and has become an activist. She's the first president of the NACW. Why the NACW? Because Black women are not prepared to funnel their politics too narrowly into the suffrage cause. Terrell is as committed a suffragist as any American woman is by the 1890s, and yet she is as committed, for example, to winning anti-lynching legislation in Congress in the very same moment. And so the NACW is and becomes the premier Black women's political organization, the premier Black women's suffrage association, but they don't call it that precisely because their agenda is much more expansive. Terrell is someone who will always keep one foot in the in NASA. She'll always keep one foot in the National Women's Party. She's not going to cede suffrage politics to white women, and she's admiring of many of them, particularly Susan Anthony, but she understands clearly that Black women's possibilities can't be contained within suffrage associations. And so her job is to galvanize Black women through the National Association of Colored Women and take them through this long campaign to the 19th Amendment, and then frankly beyond.
Fascinating. And then describe the debate and proposal and ratification of the 19th Amendment. In the end, it did protect women's suffrage, but not broader women's dignity and civil rights. There were important heroic women, including Ida B. Wells and others who were part of that debate, but give us a sense of how that debate actually culminated in the 19th Amendment.
You know, the open secret of the campaign, the latter campaign in particular to the 19th Amendment, is that there's nothing in the amendment that is going to guarantee to African American women the right to vote. Everyone knows that state laws, Jim Crow laws like poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests that have kept Black men from the polls are now going to keep Black women from the polls, even after ratification of the federal amendment. In fact, I would go so far as to say ratification of the federal amendment is only possible because the understanding is that no individual state, including Tennessee, which is the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment, no state is going to be obliged to extend the vote to African American women. Nothing will change for Black women unless state lawmakers decide otherwise. And this is the story, right? That when Black women look out across the national landscape in the fall of 1920, after the election season subsides, what they see is a profoundly uneven terrain, right? Too many of them, especially in the American South, have been kept from the polls by laws and by intimidation, by organized violence, including that of the Ku Klux Klan. And this requires Black women, like those in the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, to regroup and to build a new movement for voting rights for women out of the disappointments of the 19th Amendment. They will be left behind, frankly, by people like Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, who will not link arms. But Black women commit in 1920 to now winning federal legislation that will set aside and override those state laws and give teeth to the 15th Amendment, right, from 1870, the 19th Amendment from 1920, and finally guarantee them a place at the ballot box. And that, as we know, is another 45 years of a struggle.
It is indeed. It culminates in the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And who are some of the important African-American women who you'd like to call our attention to in that period who helped secure those landmark pieces of legislation?
Now, students of the civil rights era will know that this is a story of tens of thousands of Black Americans, including Black women, but I'll single out two. Diane Nash, who was a largely behind the scenes strategist and architect of the civil rights revolution there in Tennessee, in Nashville at the student sit-ins, behind the scenes of the freedom rides. Nash is an architect of the Selma campaign that leads to those fateful marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You don't see her face in that extraordinary news footage. And that's because she's back behind the scenes in Selma, making sure that the paramedics are on call to attend to the marchers when they are, as she anticipates, attacked. So we've got tacticians and strategists like Diane Nash, and contrast her to Fannie Lou Hamer, the one-time sharecropper turned student nonviolent coordinating committee, SNCC organizer in Mississippi in the trenches. Hamer endures violence, the loss of her livelihood, and more as she does the local organizing work around Black voting rights in the 1960s. By 1964, Fannie Lou Hamer will take the delegation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to the floor of the Democratic National Convention and insist that Black Mississippians are the legitimate representatives of the state of Mississippi rather than the white delegation that had been selected without their input. She gives an extraordinary speech before national television cameras to the Credentials Committee, making the case for Black Mississippians and all Black Americans. Hamer understood the camera, I think, as well as anyone of the civil rights generation. And her speech is on YouTube. It's about 8.5 minutes, and you can watch it. Even Lyndon Johnson knew how powerful she was, because in the midst of her remarks, Lyndon Johnson, back in Washington, called an impromptu press conference so that the national cameras would move away from Mrs. Hamer and to the president in Washington. Don't worry, later that evening, the networks broadcast her full remarks, and we have them and can watch them even today. But it is a testament to these two women, one behind the scenes and one in front of the camera, two essential leaders in the modern civil rights revolution that bring us to that Voting Rights Act in 1965.
Wow, we're all learning so much from this remarkable history lesson, and there's at least one more period that we have to put on the table, and that's the women's rights revolution of the 1960s and 70s, and that was both a political movement and a legal movement, and the legal movement included heroic African-American women like Pauli Murray, as well as women like Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Who would you like to single out in helping us understand the achievements of the women's rights movement of the 60s and 70s?
Well, the kind of legal historian that I am, I'm gonna choose Shirley Chisholm. Why? Because my view about law and the history of law is that if there aren't people willing to breathe meaning right into the texts that we produce, whether it's constitutions or statutes or judicial opinions, if there aren't people willing to breathe life into something like the Voting Rights Act, it is just a text. And Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to be seated in Congress in 1968, in the wake of the Voting Rights Act, is someone who is very intentionally setting out to ignite that new African-American electorate. And so much so that in 1972, she runs to win the Democratic Party's nomination for President of the United States. And without any disrespect to Shirley Chisholm, I think it's fair to say she doesn't think that she's going to be the party's nominee. But that's not the point, right? The point, right, is to inspire a new generation, a newly enfranchised community of Black Americans to see themselves, right, and to see the potential of their voting power at the highest echelons of the country. And Chisholm does that. She is charismatic, she is brilliant, and she is spirited. She is prepared to talk about racism and sexism and about how she's going to be the president of all the United States. And she inspires, indeed, next generations. Today, California Representative Barbara Lee, who is there in Congress, probably literally as we speak. Barbara Lee began her career as a volunteer for Shirley Chisholm in 1972. And this is the story of women in political power about generations, right? And how we bring generation after generation, whether we are educators or organizers or candidates for office, always pulling the next generations of women into that ongoing challenge, which is women's parity, women's equality, women's dignity in the political sphere.
Wow, I have learned so much from this remarkable encapsulation of all of these heroic women who have been part of the story of the increasingly embracive Constitution. I could keep on going, but Curry knows that I need to turn things back over to her because I know she has just a few questions from our friends, and then we're going to wrap up. Curry.
Sure. This is fantastic. This is the best storytelling half hour that I think we've had all year. So thank you for all the new stories we can add, and the students were adding stories that they love too. So I love this kind of group collaboration. Brian and Jacob asked the same question in two different ways. Jacob wanted to know, when did the change start to happen where women started to have control and power and property? And then some of our students asked, has that fully happened? And then Brian was wondering kind of, why did it take so long? And I know that these questions are kind of big and existential, but it's also really important to get down to what really causes this struggle to be so long for women to have authority, power. And I loved how you connected dignity and safety, because at the end of the day, that's what it is, being safe and secure too. That's freedom.
Well, voting rights don't mean very much if you can't go to the polls without being assaulted, right? And so for Black women, those two things are essentially bound up together. One way to sort of mark the change in women's legal standing and property rights comes at the Civil War era, when, and in the wake of the Civil War with Reconstruction, when we see the first and early Women's Property Acts. For the first time now, the law is going to move away from coverture and especially acknowledge women's independent capacities to control their own property, their wages, enter into contracts, and more. So that is, I think, an important break point in this story. And importantly, it's a companion to the story of women's quest for political rights, because it's going to be, I think the 14th Amendment, despite the fact that it doesn't immediately apply to women, says to American women, we need to keep working on this precise question, because the Constitution is not only changeable, the Constitution is enunciating now principles that sound an awful lot like they should apply to us. So it's a profound moment, Reconstruction, one that we rightly associate with transformations for Black Americans, but there are changes for American women that are very much part of this period. Now, I wish I knew the answer to the question of why it takes so long, because I think that it is one that women in every generation, and my book is a book that looks at 200 years. It's one in, but I'll venture a suggestion, that in many ways, our history, this is a country that does not regard American women as a whole and as a constituency, that American women have always been divided among and between themselves by lines of free and enslaved, by lines of Black and white, Asian, Native, Latinx. Those lines are sometimes certainly cultural and social, but those lines were legal and had the authority of the state behind them. So I think even today, and that was part of the question, is sort of, are we there yet? I think even today, if we looked across the political landscape, we don't see American women as coming to the polls, for example, as women, right, to work through an agenda. Instead, we see American women in a contest like the 2020 election season, where Black American women vote as a bloc, use their power at the polls collectively. This has been true since 1920. Black women have always used their political power concertedly. This is the work of historian Liette Gidlow. But white American women today are very much split, as we see evidenced by the results in November of 2020. And that too has always been true. So I don't love counterfactuals all the time, but in this story, I think we would be a very different country, frankly, if on the road to the 19th Amendment, all American women had been united and part of one constituency when it came to winning a federal amendment. That might have created a different sort of path for American women. But in that story was etched the color line, and we still see that line dividing American women today.
This has been unbelievably moving. I now have a full reading list for the entire week, weekend, even though I keep going next week. But I love this idea of Harper saying this is all bound up together. And it's all interconnected. It's all bound up together. And I think this is what makes it such a fascinating conversation for our students, because it's almost like Pandora's box. As we open it up, we find so much more that keeps going and that we want to dig into and understand. But it really is also such a powerful and uplifting story to watch women over time continue to fight and continue to push even against all odds. So thank you so much for sending us to those lights and seeing that guidance to say, what is our next job as all of us as Americans? Jeff, I'll turn it back to you to kind of wrap up the conversation.
I'm just going to thank you so sincerely as well, Professor Jones, for having inspired all of us with absolutely riveting and crucial American stories. And I'll end just by asking you for some reading recommendations for our friends. You have many important books, including the recently published Vanguard, also Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, All Bound Up Together, The Women Question in African-American Public Culture. If you wanted to recommend one of your own books for our friends to start with, that would be great. And then maybe one or two others where we can learn more about the remarkable women you've been teaching us about today.
Sure. Well, thank you for that opportunity. I will recommend Vanguard because it really was written with this community of readers in mind. And then I'll do the thing that I think students might not always love, but I'll send you to the end notes of the book for two reasons. One, because I want you to appreciate that a book like Vanguard is built out of the work of scores of historians who have been working on many of the women who I've mentioned today and countless others. And so it's not a book that one person writes. It really reflects generations of historians who have been working on Black women's political history for a long time. That's one part. The second part is I really wrote Vanguard because with an eye toward the primary sources. And so nearly all the women in Vanguard have left beautiful memoirs, letters, diaries, speeches, and more that we can go back to read for ourselves and think for ourselves about who they were. We talked about Mariah Stewart, but Shirley Chisholm's speeches. Fannie Lou Hamer is on YouTube. I really urge folks to go back to the original sources. And then a last thing, if I could pitch, is just, you know, Vanguard is the history I wanted and needed to read, and that wasn't there when I was a student. So never forget that there are lots of histories still to be written, and that if there's a history you think you need to read, that you need to know, I really encourage you to find your way to writing it down and putting it out in the world, because there's so much more to this story of the history of American women than I certainly have been able to tell. And so I really look forward to you all's stories.
What an inspiring charge. Friends, brava to Professor Jones. I hope you heard her inspiring charge to all of you to read the primary sources, hear these great women in their own voices, and then be inspired to dig deeper so that you too can be the historians like Professor Jones of the next generation, telling untold stories and being inspired. We at the Constitution Center have a project to put online primary sources from the great women and men throughout American history. And I know we'll be turning to you, Professor Jones, for advice about that important list, but it's so exciting to share them with our friends. And I cannot thank you enough on behalf of all of us for having spread so much light and wisdom during this very, very meaningful session. So thank you so much. Have a great weekend all. Please do lots of reading and be inspired by Professor Jones, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.